Hello everyone. Nice to see you again. It's Temino. Everyone. When you look at BitMobic, you might be wondering, no way, how does it have a price? Isn't it just a bunch of people buying and selling each other? It's a fair question. The BitMobic project, let's call it Mobic now, was hard forked from Bitcoin. Not just the technology of Bitcoin, but the phenomenon in its early form. Of course, we can't replicate this phenomenon exactly because we've passed 15 years, and people already know that Bitcoin exists. But I think we've succeeded in replicating it to some extent, because now people are asking questions about BitMobic. This is what is being traded in the market right now, at a price of $80, $120, or $150, whatever. You shouldn't think of it as a cross trade, because if someone is buying it like that, they're probably going to get screwed. It's just a price that people think it's worth. Of course, it could go up, just like Bitcoin, or it could crash, and go down for a while, or it could go up again in a big way, and it's hard to say which way it's going to go. It's just that now we're feeling uncomfortable, because the average person, I'm an average person, and you are like, how can an average person create a currency and claim it as a currency? There's going to be lots of questions, like waterfall, about Mobic, and that's natural, because that's what Bitcoin is asking us. Many people are discovering Bitcoin now, 15 years after Bitcoin, and you still think Bitcoin is weird, don't you? The Bitcoiners, the Bitcoin maximalists, they think Bitcoin is so superior for all these reasons. But I wish they would go back 9 years, 10 years. Bitcoin wasn't known to this many people back then, and it wasn't completely proven that it was that strong. Most importantly, Satoshi Nakamoto had only been gone for about 3 years, so he could have reappeared, and indeed, sometime later, a person claiming to be Mr. Satoshi appeared on the BBC. I'm talking about Craig Wright. Anyway, in the midst of all that, 9 years ago, 10 years ago, the question that you guys have about Mobic, I had about Bitcoin. You guys are asking, right? Does it make sense for ordinary people to create money? Does it make sense for something that's worthless to have a price? And how can we trust him? You ask these questions, right? So, a lot of people compare Bitcoin to Mobic and say, well, Mobic is not Bitcoin, so it can't be like Bitcoin. And you're right. Mobic is not Bitcoin, number one. What's different is that Mobic was created by looking at Bitcoin. In other words, people participating in the Mobic ecosystem know well about Bitcoin. But the early days of Bitcoin, there were not many people participated who knew about Bitcoin. The path that Bitcoin took was much rougher, much more uncertain. Second, how can you trust that person? That question is also useful for Bitcoin. You're under the impression that Bitcoin was decentralized and public from the beginning, and that's not the case. We think Satoshi Nakamoto mined almost entirely by himself for the first year, although he did invite other people to mine. We know that about 1.1 millions of coins are Satoshi Nakamoto's, and when we say he mined alone for a year, we also mean that there were only 1 or 2 full nodes. Mining and nodes were very close back then, because they were mining with a computer, not with a mining rig like people are now, but Mobic now has 104 full nodes. In some ways, it's even more decentralized than Bitcoin, depending on what you look at. The thing is, now you don't ask the question, do you believe Satoshi Nakamoto? And I'm still questioning about it now, because I think Hal Finney, who passed away, was Satoshi Nakamoto. And I think Hal Finney chose coin over fame. And I wrote about that in my new book, and if that's the case, then what we have now is a coin that moves periodically. I don't know if it's a Satoshi coin or not, but it was mined in 2010, 2011, and every time it moves, the market is surprised. And you could say it's because Hal Finney wanted it to move in some form after he died, because he had a family, and families have to live. The fact that he didn't burn it means that he was going to use it. And the fact that he kept his identity hidden until the end of his life says something, because honor would have been very important to him. It was to protect his family. If he had gone public and died, his family would have been hounded by tax authorities and scary people for the rest of their life. So what Hal Feeney chose to do was to have some of his coins automatically move every few years after he died to his family members. I can imagine something like that. So how much faith would you have in Satoshi Nakamoto? It's the same thing. There are people who are doing BitMobic who have some faith in me. So it's not perfect, but that's why I emphasize Bayesian inference. Don't jump to conclusions based on zeros and ones. Just trust me for like 10%, and then you trust me for 20%, and then you trust me for 30%. And then I have people who are now in Guanak Mountain, Geryong Mountain, LA, Australia, and now they're trusting me at 70%, 80%, even though they're saying 100%. The price of Bitcoin is still fluctuating right now, and it's kind of stabilized a little bit now. That's because it's gained a lot of mass. But still, we're looking at this price as very ambiguous, aren't we? The same is true for Mobic. We're just getting started, and we haven't even started to do the things that we're trying to do. So this price is actually a compromise between the expectation that it's going to go up and people thinking, and against them, who thinking this is it, this is the limit. So it's just like any other coin project, it's determined by the market. It's just that we're not publicly traded. So it's a little bit rougher than the kind of smooth supply and demand that happens on a publicly traded market. But we have it through a bunch of peer-to-peer exchanges. I don't know if I'd call them exchanges, but it's also being traded offline. First question. How does it have a price? This is a question we should be asking more legitimately about Bitcoin. How do we trust Tae Min-oh? Again, going back 9-10 years ago, we didn't have a lot of reason to trust Satoshi Nakamoto. We could only recognize that he had made a great invention, and what he was going to do with 1.1 million Bitcoins was anybody's guess. At that point, Hal Feeney was one of them, and there were questions about whether or not it was Hal Feeney. But as we moved through 2016, Craig Wright came along, and in the case of Dorian Satoshi Nakamoto, who had been on the front page of Newsweek before this, Satoshi Nakamoto came out in 2014 and said, "I'm not Dorian Satoshi Nakamoto." And by the time Craig Wright came along in 2015, Satoshi Nakamoto hadn't been active until 2016. Of course, Craig Wright supporters are saying, so Craig Wright is Satoshi Nakamoto. But now people who are suspicious of Hal Feeney are thinking, this could be the real Hal Feeney. There's a certain amount of hope here. First, how did it have a price? This is a phenomenon that's been mysterious to me forever, and I call it the monetary phenomenon. I'm not talking about the monetary phenomenon where you use money in your daily life. I'm talking about the phenomenon where people come together and consider something valuable and use it as money. Even if it has no specific use or guarantor, it still has monetary value. The second, how can you trust a founder? You can't trust this 100% surely yet. And so we'd struggled with that 10 years ago, and we're struggling with that now. There's an esotericism to early ecosystems. We have them either. Mobic has a nascent ecosystem too. Mobic is actually a copy of Bitcoin's 10-year ledger from 4 years ago. And if you go back and look at the transactions that were made at that time and are on the Mobic blockchain, I made wallets with 500,000 to 700,000 of them in 5 or 10 apiece, and I gave them to people around me. I say people around me, but they're not my friends or relatives, but people that I was involved with business. I gave them out from speaking engagements or seminars, as well as to a bunch of PhDs that I'd invite to speak to their seminars. And I gave it to people who have scalability. And if they still have it, it's like, I consider that's a big commitment. I think a lot of people have lost it. And if they have it, it's just as much of a commitment as if you followed me to Guanak Mountain or Geryong Mountain. A lot of people will have up to 1,000 of it. A few people will have a couple dozen. I gave 100 coins at Geryong Mountain, 1,500 coins at Jeju Island per person. And then I gave 2,000 coins through LA or Australia or something. So it's very small compared to the people who have been following along. But it's still an uncertainty. I think that's something going to continue to be questioned. but I think we can probably get a rough idea of it through blockchain transactions. When I hard forked it 4 years ago, it was still being mined. And the initial mining coins were on the computer at the time. And in the meantime, now the office flooded once. So a lot of the coins were buried, and in the process of re-switching and rekeying, we lost the seed. The engineer who worked with lost the seed 4 years ago. There are about 500,000 coins on the blockchain that you can't just move or make a transaction. There's this uncertainty, and that's a challenge that any coin project, including Bitcoin, that has gone through this process of being worthless to start with, other than a coin project that was funded by a business from the beginning, has. But that doesn't really affect the mainstream roadmap, because 14.7 million of the total supply is sealed publicly right now. More importantly, this Mo빅 project is a little bit different from Bitcoin. And what makes it different from the various projects that have hard forked Bitcoin is that we're going to close the books once, on January 3rd, 2029. In other words, on the 20th anniversary of Bitcoin and the 10th anniversary of the BitMobic ledger, we're going to do a blockchain ledger wipe. There are a couple of ways to do that, which we worked on with our engineers 4 years ago. And there are a couple of ways to do that. Some people think, I don't know UTXO, and I will be touching the UTXO directly, but you can't touch the UTXO directly. You can touch the indexes that are linked to the UTXO, and every coin has a maturity period. And you can manipulate the code at that time to change the value so that the coin doesn't mature forever. The most obvious way is probably to copy the coin itself, and then build a clean mainnet, starting with a Genesis block, and then exchange the coin to clear the books. The last way is the cleanest and best, but there are issues with applying new layers that have been developed. So it's a little bit technically simple, but it can be a little bit problematic business-wise. There's also a way to take over the mainnet and empty the books. The thing is, even though it's a blockchain, it is yet a private chain. I would be free and willing to do whichever system upgrades for the public good than if someone asks me that, well, he has 104 nodes in his private chain, but if he can just do a simple system upgrade like this, he could increase the number of coins, possibly. Then technically, yes, but now that there are so many stakeholders, it's business impossible to do so. There's never going to be a consensus. It's not going to be acceptable. And there's no point in me doing it if I'm not going to sell. I know you guys are going to continue to ask questions like this about BitMobic. It's actually not an only problem that you're seeing that's unique to BitMobic. It's a problem that you're actually seeing through BitMobic that should have been solved and moved on from Bitcoin in a legitimate way. Bitcoin was as mysterious and strange and bizarre and monstrous to me 10 years ago as it is to you now. And I simulated it a lot in my head and tried to figure out how to get answers. It was about a year later, in 2015, that I came up with this idea for the Mobic project. So I'm not surprised by what you're seeing now, because it's something that I've simulated a lot in my head. So there's a part of me that knew it was going to happen. Of course, I don't know everything, and how it's going to happen is another story. But I can tell you this, I'm trying to convince various companies, renewable energy companies, universities, media outlets, but it doesn't really matter. Because once it gets a price like this, it's set up in such a way that it's synergistic with each other to drive the price up, just like Bitcoin. That's what's scary about Bitcoin. No matter how much the governments and the elites and the economists and the press and the media say that Bitcoin is over, but still the Bitcoin system itself is set up in such a way that once you get above $1, which meaningful value, they support each other like this and keep pushing the price up. And I've explained that so many times in my videos. But if you don't understand it, you need to study it again. And the same goes for BitMobic. Even though I'm doing this and that, but the price of BitMobic exists regardless of that. It's more like this. Because of that possibility of doing that, once the price goes up, that price has gone up, it's become a reality, and the system is supposed to adjust to that reality. That's the scary part. Now, of course, if what you're trying to do doesn't work out, Now some people are disappointed. Now we have people who don't have time to hold. They sell it. So the price drops for a while, but then you have people who bought at the high price, and that becomes the backbone of the ecosystem, and then the price goes back up again. Of course, the more important and decisive reason is that Bitcoin is not a phenomenon that will go away. So we don't have to assume that BitMobic will go away. It's a very important thing for this blockchain industry. And if you look at our country right now, and if you look at the mainstream, they're already starting to forget that it's over. It's when it's at its darkest, you don't really expect Bitcoin to reappear, but it does, just like it always does. And then there's a phenomenon where you can understand a little bit more why BitMobic is recreating the Bitcoin phenomenon. And moreover, BitMobic has a public good, and that public good is going to be used in a way that is acceptable to society, not just for this ecosystem. In other words, because this is a public good, I am being targeted, which means to use this public good, I will not use it in a way that harms holders and where it is not beneficial to its ecosystem. It has to be beneficial to society and to the ecosystem, which is beneficial to projects with the mainstream. But if the mainstream or the organization that received it, they must use it not only to keep it for themselves. If they do so, there is no point. They should be using it to do something positive for society. Organization, have a lot of public goods like that. It could be a strategy to breaking into the business of blockchain, or we could develop blockchain technology with this. I've got all these public goods, I've made them public, I've said where I am going to use them, and I've got people watching. So I'm a little bit hopeful that maybe the path of BitMobic's development will be a little bit different from the price fluctuations of Bitcoin and other altcoins. I don't know for sure, but my hypothesis is that uncertainty plays a big role in price fluctuations, not just external attacks, but actually selling by big holders, and then there's a kind of fear of big holders selling. BitMobic has a countermeasure for this. First of all, I'm the biggest holder, and I've made all of mine public, and there are quite a few people who have pledged to their mining rights, let's say 10,000 coins or more per household, if they came over and followed everywhere and Australia. I'm going to lock up theirs too. I couldn't lock up all of theirs. At least I could do so up to half of theirs for a dividend for mining. If that happens, it will be interesting to see how the price path of BitMobic behaves and how it differs from other altcoins and Bitcoin. What makes it different from other altcoins is that it's designed to minimize the ability of big holders to get greedy and sell off. And what makes it different from Bitcoin is that it doesn't have as much uncertainty as Bitcoin. So even if there's an attack from the outside and people say this is the truth of the matter, you can rest assured that the wallets of the big holders are not moving. And if the people who created it and the key members of it are out in the open and they're all walking around, I think that would make people a little bit less anxious. And I think it would be interesting to see how that would affect the price. Of course, it could possibly crash, but still, it doesn't mean the end this experiment. It doesn't go to zero. I think it would be very interesting for you to watch BitMobic with these points in mind. The important thing is that this phenomenon that we have created in BitMobic is not as harmful or dangerous to society as you think. Or at least it is a great contribution to the mainstream that thinks that Bitcoin is going to disappear and that it is a joke, and to those who want to regulate Bitcoin badly. In addition, I can't tell you everything, but we're going to make BitMobic a public good for the development of finance and IT technology in Korea. And because blockchain is so important, we're going to select public goods and provide them to companies so that they can be used for that. And we will be using those public goods to participate good engineers and good people for this. There's a lot more to it, but I think you'll find this phenomenon of BitMobic, which is a hard fork of Bitcoin, recreating the monetary phenomenon of Bitcoin interestingly. And I think you'll find that all of these things that you're seeing in Mobic are actually just reminding you of the same questions that I had about Bitcoin 10 years ago. Some of you keep saying that it's a religious phenomenon. But in the first place, there are similar properties to monetary phenomena, whether it's political or religious phenomena, where people behave in groups, and you just call it a religious phenomenon. It's not a religious phenomenon. It's a collective phenomenon where you have a bunch of people, and each person is a rational economic agent in economics, and when you put them together in a group, they behave differently. That's true in politics, crowd psychology, sports, and it's true in religion. If you see it that way, I think you can look at it a little bit more positively, and you can enjoy the phenomenon that has already started. I thought it might help you get some intellectual satisfaction, so I made this video. Everyone, see you next time. Thank you.